Fyodor Seuss Geisel was a beloved children's author and illustrator who wrote dozens and dozens of books throughout the 20th century. If you don't recognize him, well, you might recognize his pen name, Dr. Seuss. I find it hard to believe that anyone, at least in this corner of the world, has not heard of Dr. Seuss. Many of his books are household names at this point, and a lot have been adapted into shorts, movies, television series, a Broadway musical. And Dr. Seuss himself is definitely a household name that most Americans associate as a staple of childhood. Despite all that, I didn't know what he looked like until just recently, and I didn't know his real name until I started this video. Well, okay, I knew it was Ted, because the kids in the Lorax 2012 are named after Geisel and his second wife.
Oh, hi, Ted.
Oh, hey, Audrey.
But that's it. He's rarely, if ever, represented with a picture of himself. In fact, he's usually represented by the cat, or his hat. And as far as I've seen, his books don't really have about the author sections. He's just a name on a cover. A name that has written a lot of books a lot of people loved as children, and as such, he's sort of become a symbol of imagination, whimsy, and childhood literacy in American culture. Read Across America Day is celebrated on Geisel's birthday, and my elementary school used to celebrate it by having us all wear the hat from The Cat in the Hat and read Dr. Seuss's books. Some people even celebrate it by discontinuing his books. Yep, if you haven't heard the news yet, Dr. Seuss has been cancelled. Or at least he was like 6 months ago. Whoops. 2 videos about cancel culture in a row. Good job, Grace. The Seuss estate were peer pressured by the woke SJW mob into banning their own beloved properties. The Cat in the Hat. Oh no, wait, that's still there. How about How the Grinch Stole Christmas? Oh wait, no, that's fine too. Green Eggs and Ham? The Lorax? Wait, so what did they... Oh, okay. So the 6 books that have been discontinued are McElligot's Pool, Scrambled Egg Super, If I Ran the Zoo, and To Think That I Saw It on Mulberry Street, On Beyond Zebra, and The Cat's Quizzer. I've never even heard of half of these books. What the hell? No, seriously, I've had several interactions in real life where people were so mad that Dr. Seuss was canceled, but after I read off the titles that were being removed, they admitted that they'd never even heard of those books before. No one was talking about these books. No one was trying to take him down. The Seuss estate made this decision for itself, and based on the fact that all these books are several layers of obscure, I'd bet that had they not made any kind of announcement and just quietly removed them, no one would have noticed. But, they did make an announcement. Woo boy, did they make an announcement. These books portray people in ways that are hurtful and wrong. Ceasing sales of these books is only part of our commitment and our broader plan to ensure Dr. Seuss Enterprises catalog represents and supports all communities and families. Now, I'm not much of a conspiracy theorist myself, but considering most people I know have never heard of the titles being removed, I can imagine these books aren't exactly big sellers. Add on the fact that there is some questionable imagery that could potentially damage the brand, more on that later, the decision to discontinue these books makes sense. But despite the fact that they specifically say that they made this decision last year, they went out of their way to make their announcement on Dr. Seuss's birthday. There is no way they wouldn't have known that that would cause some sour feelings.
Now, as it happens, today is Dr. Seuss's birthday, since he would be 117 years old were he alive today. And thank God he isn't.
And frankly, they didn't have to do anything after that, because the clickbait news sites did the work for them. Since there really isn't any iconic imagery from any of these books, when people talk about it, they'll use more well-known characters that people grew up with and use well-known stories in their thumbnails.
The business group that protects Dr. Seuss's legacy says that move is to make sure his catalog represents and supports all communities and families.
So people started buying Seuss books like crazy. Literally Literally, the Amazon top 10 was instantly almost entirely Dr. Seuss books, and none of them were any of the books that were being discontinued. In the words of my cousin Joanna, I mean, it is very smart. Take books that aren't selling well, use nostalgia and fear that they're going to take away these books, money, money bag. This was a text message. And it worked on me too. I now own several more Seuss books than I did before, mostly for research purposes, but the cold hand of capitalism cares not for motives. But was he racist? And were the images in these books really bad enough to stop selling them altogether? I was only familiar with 2 of these books. McGillicuddy's Pool had an entire song in Seussical, which is hilarious, and If I Ran the Zoo has an entire play area at Universal Studios dedicated to it, which is even more hilarious. Mulberry Street also apparently has a gift shop, but like, Seuss Landing doesn't appear to be closing. Like, don't worry about it. But If I Ran the Zoo was also read to me at the library as a child, and I was initially kind of confused at the inclusion. It's about animals, right? So how could there be... Oh my god. I like how the guy I found online reading it also realized that this was pretty messed up, because he changed one of the lines.
With helpers who all wear such very cool pants.
The Seuss estate hasn't actually gone into any detail about which specific images caused the books to get pulled, to the point that even Wikipedia has to guess. But I don't know, I think it's pretty damn clear. Like, what does this even mean? No, seriously, what does this mean? There was a point where these types of images weren't exactly unusual for Dr. Seuss. There is this drawing he made apparently back in the 20s.
All thanks to this image, a 4-panel cartoon by the then 25-year-old Theodore Geisel, which appeared in the political magazine Judge in 1929.
Which I get is probably satire. This comic is about rich white dudes buying things that are absurd and don't work, and yeah. But satire or not, it's gross, the imagery is gross, the language is gross, and he drew black people the exact same way when he used to work in advertising, particularly for the pesticide company Flit, from the late 20s to the early 40s. And of course, there are his political cartoons that he created during World War II. Some of these cartoons are, well, he portrayed Japanese people pretty horrendously and seemed pretty sure that Japanese Americans were the enemy, that they were still loyal to Japan and ready to betray America at any moment, which is a pretty bold stance for a German American to take during World War II, but go off, I guess. I was always under the impression he was a political cartoonist before he started making kids' books, but no, he actually took a break from making books during World War II so he could focus on making cartoons and helping with the war effort. So needless to say, his old art and the children's books are pretty intertwined. His art style remained remarkably consistent for most of his career, and the style of both his advertisements and his political cartoons resemble his children's books, which is really unsettling. And some of the imagery he used in the cartoons even got repurposed later in his books. And this actually isn't the first time Mulberry Street has acknowledged the problematic nature of its illustrations. Before 1978, this is what the image of the Chinese man looked like. Yes, really. And this was the first book he'd ever written. This stuff is baked right into the core of Dr. Seuss's works, even in some that are way more well-known than the 6 books that got discontinued.
A cat in a hat!
In researching for this video, I came across the claim that the Cat in the Hat, the most popular and well-known Seuss character, as well as the literal symbol of Dr. Seuss himself, is essentially blackface. I have never seen anyone say this. I was on both Twitter and Tumblr during the Seuss-pocalypse, and no one ever brought this up. So my initial reaction to this was, well, yes, he's a black cat. But one, he did that thing that cats did where they gave a black cat a white face. So at least that aspect of it doesn't visually resemble blackface. And 2, I know that Dr. Seuss books have a reputation for being extremely colorful, and while a lot of his later ones are, most of his older ones have an extremely limited color palette. The Cat in the Hat only has 4 colors: black, white, red, and blue. Well, 3 colors technically. The paper is white. I initially thought this was for budget reasons. I mean, McElligot's Pool had every couple of pages printed in black and white to save the publisher money, but apparently Dr. Seuss insisted on it for stylistic reasons. Regardless, the limited color palette could definitely be a reason for the cat being black, especially since a lot of the mascot suits portray him as being a shaded white cat. However, you know that if that's all there was, I wouldn't be talking about it. I mean, first of all, I already showed plenty of examples of Dr. Seuss drawing blackface, but yeah, alright. Some of those were decades before The Cat in the Hat. It doesn't really prove anything. However, according to Judith and Neil Morgan's official biography on Dr. Seuss, he believed that the Cat in the Hat was born in the scarred brass cage of an ancient elevator at Horton Mifflin Publishing House in Boston. This elevator rose and descended with shutters and winds, cajoled by a small, stooped woman wearing a leather half-glove and a secret smile. Ted rode with her one day in the spring of 1955 and never forgot her, nor the noisy contraption that was her domain. Then, for the Cat in the Hat's 50th anniversary, Anita Silvey, a children's book editor, author, and friend of Geisel, went on NPR to talk about the book's creation, saying,
"And that elevator was powered and directed by a very elegant, very petite African-American woman named Annie Williams. And she was renowned for putting fresh flowers there, and she dressed beautifully, and she always wore white gloves and was known for her sly, even foxy smile, I might say. She had a magnificent smile. And Seuss, as they were going up, Spalding was talking about this book that he wanted Dr. Seuss to write. And when Seuss went back to sketch the character of the Cat in the Hat, he told us that he, in fact, thought of Mrs. Williams and that elevator ride. And he gave her the white gloves. He gave the cat the white gloves and the smile of Mrs. Williams.
Okay, first of all, he better have written that woman a check. No, seriously. The Cat in the Hat is one of the most recognizable literary icons ever created, and a major cash cow for the Seuss estate even to this day. And the fact it was someone that they knew and that they stole, bastardized, and made millions off of her image is pretty fucking gross. And that's just assuming it was just her smile and her gloves. The fact that she was a black woman and the cartoon based off of her is a black cat is suspicious. That's really suspicious. But okay, Geisel did have other inspirations for the cat. Crazy Cat is often credited as an inspiration. Created in 1913 by George Harriman, Crazy Cat is a little gender-fluid cat, no seriously, who is in love with a mouse who keeps throwing bricks at them. Geisel really liked Crazy Cat. He had praised Harriman's comic for its beautifully insane sanities. The cat supposedly got his red bow tie from Crazy Cat, and oh, holy fucking shit. Jesus Christ. Crazy Cat is actually kind of complicated. Its creator was actually a mixed race man who was white passing, and it wasn't even known that he was mixed race until almost 3 decades after his death. The guy drew some really messed up stuff that's wicked depressing when viewed through that lens, but it's not really my place to explore it any deeper. And sad or not, the imagery is still horrible. And it's startling that one of the most beloved childhood icons of all time could be inspired by this. The Cat in the Hat is a shockingly influential book when you get right down to it. It was actually created in response to the Dick and Jane books of the 1950s. In case you don't know, Dick and Jane were a series of books used to teach young kids how to read throughout the mid-century. and were extremely popular with teachers. Apparently, by the 1950s, they were practically the only books classrooms were offering. And not only were they completely boring Wonder Bread non-stories, they were also not good at teaching kids how to read. In 1955, Rudolph Flesch wrote a book entitled Why Johnny Can't Read, in which he put these readers and the American school system as a whole on blast. Go to your school tomorrow morning, or if Johnny has brought home one of his readers, look at it. You will immediately see that all the words in it are learned by endless repetition, not a sign anywhere that letters correspond to sounds and that words can be worked out by pronouncing the letters. No, the child is told what each word means, that they are mechanically, brutally hammered into his brain. He goes on to explain that this method of having children memorize every single word one at a time makes it so that they are unable to read anything that has words unfamiliar to them, and also gives them a lack of tools they could use to figure out the words for themselves, which means that most books in the library that were originally written for kids were also completely inaccessible for kids because most of them had words kids in the 1950s had not been taught. And these readers literally had no plot whatsoever. Just these two white-ass kids telling each other to look at stuff over and over and over again.
Look, Jane. Look. See, Dick? See, oh, see, Dick? Come down, Dick. Come and see the big mother. See the funny little baby. Puff is my baby. Puff is my funny little baby. I see the big mother. I see the little baby. Look, Jane. See the big father. Look, Jane. Look, see baby. Oh. Funny baby. Oh, these books really do suck.
The 1950s seemed like a terrible time to be alive. I don't know why people romanticize it so much. Publisher William Spalding, having read Flesch's book and other similar articles, commissioned Ted Geisel to write a more exciting book to teach kids how to read. He provided Geisel with a list of about 350 words that all 6-year-olds should know and told him he could not use any words that were not on the list. It's funny, Dr. Seuss is known for making up words, but I never noticed before that his most famous book doesn't have any made-up words in it at all. He found this limitation extremely difficult. Apparently his two favorite words as a kid were queen and zebra, but neither were on the list. And then he wanted to write a story about a bird, but bird wasn't on the list either. Do 6-year-olds not know what birds are? Legend has it that Geisel got so fed up that he just decided to write the book about the first 2 words he found that rhymed. He found cat and hat, and the rest is history. And, you know, viewed through the lens of the story being a direct response to Dick and Jane, and the story literally being about a strange, unusual creature showing up to entertain a little boy and a little girl who are living extremely boring lives, I think a fair interpretation would be that The Cat in the Hat represents more interesting and lively literature. Hell, maybe he represents the very book he stars in. He wants the kids to have fun and is trying to teach them how. All the while, this fish speaks out against him, telling the children that their mother would not approve of them associating with this cat. And at first, the fish seems to be right. Things do get out of hand. But then when the kids put their foot down and say that this is going too far, that's enough, the cat stops, and he cleans up his mess. He leaves absolutely no trace that he was there, or even that he had any kind of an impact at all, except on the children, who were left unsure if they should even tell their mother what happened. The book almost seems to be saying that letting your kids experience something a little weird and wacky isn't going to hurt them. It isn't going to cause their entire lives to fall apart. Just because something isn't the boring old Wonder Bread that you're used to doesn't mean it's dangerous or even irresponsible, and that kids are smart and capable enough to know when things are going too far and when to stop it. Geisel would go on to make a lot more beginner books dedicated to teaching children how to read. One Fish, Two Fish, Red Fish, Blue Fish, The Foot Book. Okay, so I was looking around in the attic to see if we had any Dr. Seuss books already. What the hell, Mom? Hop on Pop, Green Eggs and Ham. Green Eggs and Ham is actually the result of a bet that Dr. Seuss couldn't write a book with only 50 words, and he did it. And Wikipedia lists them all in alphabetical order. The beginner books also feature titles from other authors too. Go Dogs Go, Are You My Mother? I legit thought these books were written by Dr. Seuss as a kid because of this little cat in the hat in the corner here. Doesn't help that they're apparently sold in the Dr. Seuss section of my local Barnes & Nobles. Not to mention all the other thousands of titles that exist outside of beginner books that are meant to be easy for small children to read. They wouldn't exist today, at least how they are, if it wasn't for the cat in the hat. That's actually why Read Across America Day is celebrated on Geisel's birthday, because he helped to improve literacy in this country and made reading fun for children in general. Geisel himself even said that he's the most proud of the Cat in the Hat because it helped to kill off Dick and Jane. But does that excuse the cat's racist origins? Is it okay to overlook it because some good came out of it? I'm not the right person to answer that question, obviously. I'm a white person. I am not and should not be the final authority on what is and isn't racist. But unfortunately, the knowledge of the cat's origins does kind of put a damper on the story, that it's about a black character breaking into a white family's house and causing mayhem.
A monster? Where?
I don't think that was the intended interpretation, but it's there, and it's pretty hard to ignore once you have the whole picture. Now, granted, looking over his whole body of work, it does appear that Geisel did educate himself as the years went on. The man did have an extremely bigoted view of Japanese people. It's pretty damn hard to deny that. But in the early 50s, he actually took a trip to Japan, and it apparently inspired him to write Horton Hears a Who, which is dedicated to his great friend, Mitsuji Nakamura of Kyoto, Japan. I am so sorry if I pronounced that wrong. And Horton Hears a Who is actually an extremely anti-racist story. I know some people like to say it's pro-life because of the whole a person's a person no matter how small thing.
A person's a person, no matter how small.
But first of all, Geisel nipped that in the butt pretty fast, straight up threatening to sue pro-life activists who were using the phrase. And anyways, abortion wasn't really a hotly contested political issue until the 60s and 70s, decades after Horton Hears a Who was published. But racism certainly was. Horton Hears a Who was actually published the same exact year as the Brown versus the Board of Education ruling, which ended segregation in schools. Besides, I think the small thing is supposed to be metaphorical. Because yes, the Who's themselves are extremely small, and that does cause them some problems, but their main problem isn't so much their smallness, it's that the others are bigger than them, and because of that, have power over them, whether they realize it or not. The Who's have no control as to how their lives go, and if the other animals want to hurt them, they have literally no way to combat it. There's this kind of Lovecraftian horror when it comes to the Who's. No, seriously, their entire planet is completely reliant on a giant otherworldly creature who they cannot see but knows that he exists because he talks to them and carries them around. Other giant creatures sometimes steal their planet and toss it around, and one day, the otherworldly creature who protects them tells them if they don't scream loud enough, they're all going to die. Does anyone else ever think about this, or is it just me? So yeah, for all intent and purposes, the Who's are at a steep disadvantage when it comes to life. They are literally terrorized by most of the other animals who don't think anything of the cruelty they inflict because they legitimately don't see the Who's as people. The only animal that attempts to use his size advantage to help the smaller group is ostracized and punished. He very clearly helped the Who's in some very significant ways, but at the end of the day, it's not enough because he is severely outnumbered by the other animals. The only way to save the Who's is to convince all the animals that they are people, and with Horton now predisposed, the Who's are forced to rise up and save their own lives. The climax of this book is literally a marginalized group of people having to prove they are people or they will all die. And they do it by yelling, screaming, making as much noise as possible. And it works! The Whos prove their humanity, and the other animals pledge to spend their lives protecting them just as Horton did before them. What's notable here too is that neither Horton nor the Whos are the ones who go through an arc. Despite the book literally being named after them, it's the other animals who go through an arc. They go from mocking Horton and trying to boil an entire race of people for the crime of just existing, to being shocked when those people gain a voice, listening to that voice, learning, and finally becoming allies themselves. Could this be a metaphor for the transformation of Geisel himself, where he went from drawing horrible caricatures of what he thought Japanese people were to befriending and being inspired by the actual real-life people? Maybe? I don't know. Who's to say, really? It's possible, I guess. And Horton Hears a Who isn't the only anti-racism story in Seuss's catalog. The Sneetches, published in 1961, are about some yellow bird-like creatures that live on the beach. There are two types of Sneetches, one that have stars on their bellies and ones that don't. The star-bellied Sneetches think they are better than the non-starred belly Sneetches, and they don't let their kids play with the plain belly Sneetches or let them enter their spaces. Then one day, a guy named Sylvester McMonkey McBean shows up with a machine that could put stars on their bellies, so all the plain-bellied Sneetches pay to go through it, and they come out looking exactly like the star-bellied Sneetches. Now, I've seen some criticism thrown at this story, claiming that it's simply a, look, we can't tell each other apart. I guess we're the same after all. Racism is over kind of story, and lacks any deeper look at racism and oppression. And I would agree if the story ended here, but it doesn't. The original star-bellied Sneetches see that the plain-bellied Sneetches have also gotten stars, have gotten this symbol of privilege that they alone have enjoyed up to this point. And they are fucking pissed. They still see themselves as superior, but now they don't have a way to prove it because now everyone looks exactly alike.
We're the true star-bellies. We had them first. We're still the best Sneetches, and they're still the worst. Yeah! But how are we going to prove it?
So, they pay Sylvester McMonkey McBean to take the stars off their bellies. The thing that they were originally pointing to as proof that they were superior. They pay to have it removed. They don't want it now that the group that they perceive as being lesser has it. They don't want the other Sneetches to be equal to them. They need to retain the privilege and power they have, even if it means destroying the entire identity they built up for themselves. It's almost as if bigotry and discrimination aren't really about superficial physical differences, but deeper feelings of perceived superiority. The star-bellied Sneetches feel as if they are better than the plain-bellied Sneetches, even if they have no way to prove it. Even if all boundaries are removed, even if everyone looks exactly the same, there will always be people who want to be powerful and superior. There was a Fairly Odd Parents episode similar to this. Timmy was tired of being made fun of for his appearance, so he wished for everyone to look exactly alike, only to find he was still being made fun of.
I can't believe this! Everybody in the world's exactly alike, and those creeps still think they're better than everyone else!
It doesn't matter who you are or what you look like. If someone thinks they are better than you, then they will use anything to justify treating you terribly. The Sneetches' quest for equality and supremacy ends up escalating, going through the two machines to get rid of and get new stars so quickly that they lose track of who is who. They don't remember who originally had the stars and who didn't, so they're forced to face their peers as they are. Now that the thing they were using to discriminate against each other is gone and they physically can't do that anymore, they're finally able to see past the bigotry and view each other as equals. There it is. There's the oversimplified, we're all the same message. Hey, I never said it wasn't in here. There's just a couple extra layers before we actually get to it. And this story is by no means a perfect allegory. One criticism I've seen thrown at it is that historically, minority groups who are ostracized tend to create their own cultures and identities. So having the plain-bellied Sneetches linger sadly outside the weenie roasts is a bit inaccurate. More realistically, the plain-bellied Sneetches would have their own weenie roasts, and the starred-bellied Sneetches would get mad that they weren't invited and call the police, and it'd be a whole thing. This is a totally valid criticism, But Dr. Seuss was also a white guy, and he was writing the world how he saw it, and this feels like an outsider's oversimplified perspective on how segregation works. It's flawed, but it's still a very obvious anti-racist message that any child can understand. But does that mean that at this point Geisel wasn't racist anymore? That he took a trip to Japan and was cured of all of his racism and is now actively fighting against it? Well, this is where we start getting into confusing territory. The Sneetches, like quite a few of the other Seuss titles, first appeared in the magazine Redbook. Sometime between its first appearance and when it was printed in book form, someone told Geisel that it might be interpreted as being anti-Semitic due to the stars on the bigoted Sneetches' bellies. And this apparently really bothered Geisel. According to his publisher, Robert L. Bernstein, Geisel despised even the slightest hint of any kind of racism and had to be convinced that his book would not be misinterpreted. And you could actually see a similar attitude reflected in a few of his political cartoons as well. Here's one that uses outdated language but showcases black workers trying to get jobs, having to navigate an impossible maze to do so. This is Geisel literally making commentary on a systematic problem with racism in this country, that the war effort might have kickstarted the economy, but a lot of people still weren't able to find jobs because of their race. Or this one, where he shows a desire for the racism to be taken out of people in a fashion that resembles his old Flit ads. You know, the ones that looked like this. And even more startling is that these two cartoons calling out racism were drawn the same exact year as a lot of Geisel's anti-Japanese cartoons. Did he not see these as racist? And it is significant that he seemingly learned and grew after visiting Japan for himself, but then what the actual fuck is The Cat's Quizzer? That was published a full 2 decades after Horton Hears a Who. That's kind of the strange dichotomy I've stumbled into while researching Dr. Seuss. He seemed to consider himself to be anti-racist, while in the same breath being extremely racist. But yeah, I mean, people are honestly a lot more complicated than just racist or not racist. We all grow up in society with baked-in biases, and you'd be shocked by just how many seemingly harmless and ordinary things have extremely racist beginnings. The Cat in the Hat isn't nearly as explicit as other characters. I mean, you take one look at the crows from Dumbo and you know exactly what they're going for. But with the Cat in the Hat, millions and millions of people had looked at this character and questioned nothing. Hell, there are a lot of characters who have questionable origins who are considered part of mainstream culture. Crazy Cat might have been pretty openly explicit about its inspirations, but pretty much all cartoons from that time were based off of minstrel shows in one way or another. Hell, it took me a total of 5 minutes to find a cartoon where Mickey Mouse was doing blackface, which was stuck on a DVD and sold to the public as recently as 2004. And he's literally the face of the biggest media conglomerate in the world today, and no one ever questions it. I certainly never did, and Geisel himself might not have either. The man who literally wrote the book about Dr. Seuss being racist, my best friend, Philip Nell, no seriously though, thanks for being the only person to ever answer me, even says that on some level the racist origins of the Cat in the Hat was probably subconscious. It's actually kind of ordinary, and that's part of the point. Racism is ordinary. It's not apparent, it's not strange, and that's why Seuss is useful to think about. He is an example of how even progressive, anti-racist people can act in ways that are racist. I don't think he's intentionally recycling stereotypes in his book from the 50s, but the imagination is influenced by the culture in which it grows, and it doesn't necessarily filter out the racism bits during artistic creation. Now, this isn't to say that Geisel is off the hook, because he might not have intended to put anything racist, because honestly, whether it was purposeful or not is irrelevant when the only POC in his stories are horribly stereotyped caricatures. Sure, some stuff with his name on it have worked to fix it in recent years, but he never did. It's ridiculous to suggest he was completely innocent and there's nothing harmful in these stories at all. We all grow up with biases and prejudices that we may not even know about, along with blind spots for topics we might not have ever thought about in any kind of depth, and it's extraordinarily easy for them to bleed into your works. My dear friend Emily, who is helping me write this video, is not too fond of the book Green Eggs and Ham, because to her, it's a book that encourages ignoring consent. And I can definitely see where she's coming from. This guy keeps telling Sam I Am no, over and over again. And Sam I Am keeps on trying to force his will on him until he finally gives in. 50 no's and 1 yes isn't a yes, if you know what I'm saying. Now, obviously that wasn't the intended message of the book. It was very clearly supposed to be about trying new things. I'm not saying green eggs and ham should get booted out of Space Jam or anything like that, but hey, worth pointing out. Or how about how Horton is an African animal who gets kidnapped, brought onto a boat, shipped to America, and sold at auction? I know Horton probably doesn't live in Africa. Kangaroos don't live in Africa. This is obviously just a fantasy fig. But wow, that was a fun realization I had while driving to work at 6 a.m. Another fun realization I had while going through Geisel's work is that the two main antagonists Horton faces are both single mothers. Or I assume the kangaroo is a single mother. I don't know. I'm sure it's a coincidence. One story is explicitly about parenthood, and the other shows the impact a prejudiced environment has on children, as the little kangaroo mimics all the hateful things his mother says.
And the small kangaroo in her pouch said, "Me too."
And if you want that kind of message in your animal story, kangaroos are almost always portrayed as carrying their babies with them. The mothers carry the babies. It makes sense. It's just funny when you notice, especially since there aren't a lot of female characters throughout the bulk of Seuss's work. And that's not an original observation. In 1990, novelist Alison Lurie wrote an article called The Cabinet of Dr. Seuss, in which she states, for one thing, there is the almost total lack of female protagonists. Indeed, many of his stories have no female characters at all. The typical Seuss hero is a small boy or a male animal. When little girls appear, they play silent secondary roles. The most memorable female in his entire oeuvre is the despicable Mayzie, the lazy bird who callously traps Horton into sitting on her egg so that she could fly off to Palm Beach. Geisel actually seemed aware of this criticism. Dr. Seuss and Mr. Geisel, which was published in 1995, brings up the article and says, Ted had not responded to Lurie, but pointed that most of his characters are animals, and if she could identify their sex, I'll remember her in my will. And yes, he is right in the fact that the vast majority of the creatures that show up in his books are not gendered in any way. I mean, sure, the Lorax refers to the Barbaloots as boys, and all the creatures in Scrambled Egg Super are probably female, but male penguins hold the eggs, so really who knows? But like, yes, obviously, I wouldn't have expected him to assign genders to every single creature in One Fish, Two Fish, Red Fish, Blue Fish, but she was clearly talking about the named characters, right? The ones who have a role in the story, who have their names and faces on the covers of the books, because there is a very blatant disparity between the genders in that regard. I mean, of all the original Seuss stories where the title is literally the name of a character, only one of those characters is female, Gertrude McFuzz. Lurie actually talked about Gertrude in her article, stating, another unattractive bird, Gertrude McFuzz in Yertle the Turtle and Other Stories, is vain, envious, greedy, stupid, and fashion mad. Now, that is a bit harsh, and frankly, when I saw Seussical the Musical, which features Gertrude in a starring role, I had never heard of her before. But she was likable enough in Seussical, and despite the fact she is clearly squeezed into a role she was never meant to be in, a la the love interest, her entire story from the book is still intact. A bird has a one-feathered tail, wants to get a bigger tail, eats some magic berries, tail gets too big, gets plucked off, lesson about loving yourself for who you are. The way this is presented in the musical is that Gertrude wants a bigger tail to get Horton to notice her.
Who'd notice a bird with a one-feathered tail?
The actual love story part of her character isn't done particularly well. Don't get me wrong, it's sweet that the reason she likes him is because he's nice.
I was hooked from the start when I noticed your kind and your powerful heart.
That's cute, but it also seems like the reason she helps Horton is because she wants him to like her.
And maybe now you know I care for you.
not because she actually cares or even believes in his journey.
Put down the clover.
There's also this weird plot hole where she finds Horton's clover for him, despite not being able to hear the who's. How did she? And her big moment in the show is a powerful number about how far of a distance she's gone to find Horton.
I sailed on a junk and was practically sunk. I trampled through the trees full of furious bees. I galloped through the snow and a loving below for you.
Only for everyone else to show up out of nowhere and whisk Horton back to the jungle in like 2 seconds. This isn't an issue because it's a completely contrived way to get Horton back to the jungle, because it happens in the book too. No, it's because the culmination of Gertrude's character exists in this number where she explains what a perilous journey she went on to find Horton because she loves him.
There's nothing that I wouldn't, and I couldn't, and I haven't gone through.
And then it shows that everyone else in the jungle also went on that journey.
Ah! How did you get here?
But what's really important here is that the other birds notice how small her tail is, comment on it,
And there's certainly nothing so offish on you. Thank you, Mayzie.
and then pressure her to do something about it.
Get those pills! Get the pills! And you can have free!
That I found interesting, that there was a pressure to conform to society's standard of beauty. And I legitimately thought that's what the book was about. I mean, sure, it was the 1950s, but The Twilight Zone had an episode about conforming to beauty standards that aired just a few years after the story was published.
And the nicest part of all, Val, I look just like you.
Granted, I'm not huge on the anti-plastic surgery implications here, but I don't know, it could work. There's a huge difference between doing something for your body because you want to and doing something for your body because you feel like you have to. But when I actually read the original story, I didn't like Gertrude. Her entire reasoning for getting a new tail was because she's jealous of another bird her age that has a 2-feathered tail. A bird who never makes fun of her, or pressures her, or even speaks to her. Or speaks at all, for that matter. Nonetheless, Gertrude hates this bird, so she eats too many pillberries entirely because she wants the other bird to envy her, which causes her tail to get too big for her to move. And it's at this point that Gertrude loses any drive she had in the story. Her uncle shows up, carries her home, and plucks her new tail off. It completely removes her agency in the narrative. If the story ended with her stuck on the hill for a day or two before finally deciding to get rid of her new beautiful tail so she could go home, that would show her choosing life over perceived beauty and would show actual character growth. But the responsibility of getting herself home or getting rid of her new tail is never put on her. The choice is made for her. And then we're told that she's smarter now, but is she? We never actually saw her learn anything. Also, why does she have to go back to the 1 feather if she hates it so much? She could fly just fine with 2 feathers. Why couldn't she just keep that? What the fuck? This is something I think the musical actually does right. Sure, she still isn't the one who plucks her tail off, but she's the one who chooses to pluck it off.
Pluck it out! Get it off! I won't do it again!
And she's forced to make this choice after her tail prevents her from helping Horton, the one she was trying to impress in the first place.
When the hunters caught you, I could see that I'd been foolish because I couldn't even help you. No, I couldn't even fly.
So yeah, the musical gave Gertrude more agency in her own story, and I am here for it. Also, I guess it does sort of highlight the fact that Dr. Seuss had so few female characters in his books that when they wanted to give Horton a love interest for some godforsaken reason, they had to go for an extremely obscure character no one cares about in the first place. I mean, you have to admit that's at least a little funny. But I have a confession to make. You know how earlier I said that only one Dr. Seuss book had a title that actually featured a female character? That was a blatant lie. Well, no, that's not true. If you pull up a list of Dr. Seuss books, you will get all the kids' books he wrote, and Gertrude isn't technically on that list because she's a short story within the Yertle book, but like, whatever, you know she's there. But this is not a complete list. No. It leaves off the books that were published after Seuss's death. Daisy Head Mayzie was originally published in 1994, 3 years after his death, and apparently was actually written by him. But honestly, the question of whether or not to consider this an actual Dr. Seuss book is complicated. I mean, in 2016, they republished it to be based more off of his actual story and illustrations. Wait, you had his illustrations this whole time and you didn't use them? And there are some noticeable differences in the story. The whole Fame story arc is gone. The Cat in the Hat doesn't appear in the 2016 edition despite originally being shoehorned into most of the original book. Also, the 1994 version has the mom actually working a job, while the original version Seuss apparently made has her as a housewife, which is hilarious. Did you know that they're still releasing new Seuss books? The most recent one was released in 2019, and like 6 years ago, they released a new Horton book, Horton and the Quagger Bug, where this shitty little bug asks Horton for a ride and then takes advantage of his kindness and is punished at the end. Like, are we considering this canon? Are we considering any of this canon? Fuck it, I'm analyzing this book like it is. So there's this girl, Mayzie, right? Not to be confused with the bird, Mayzie. That's another thing. Her name is a mix between two existing Seuss characters. Anyways, one day a daisy grows out of her head, and all the adults freak the fuck out until this one dude shows up, gives Mayzie a contract, and suddenly it's a story about how fame and money doesn't make you happy, which completely comes out of nowhere. This wasn't a story about a girl who wanted to be famous. We don't even get to see how she feels about any of the things happening to her until the end, which, yeah, again, Mayzie doesn't really have agency throughout most of her own story, but this time it actually kind of works. From the second the daisy pops up on Maisie's head, she suddenly loses all control of her life. The adults are constantly making decisions about her own health, and not consulting her at all. And in fact, they are very much exploiting her. The doctor wants to use her to get a grant. The mayor tries to use her to get reelected. And the daisy is a hindrance on her life. She gets bullied for it, it attracts bees, it hurts when it gets pulled, she almost dies when it starts to wilt. Meanwhile, you have all these adults, most who don't care or even know her, arguing about who gets to be the one to take care of the situation. So when this record executive guy shows up, Mayzie sees it as a chance to take back her own life, to take this situation that has been forced upon her and turn it into a positive. But yeah, no surprise, this guy is exploiting her too. Hurt and overwhelmed, Mayzie runs away, despairing that because she left her family that they will never want her back, only for the daisy to assure her that they do love her by doing the they love me not thing with its petals.
They love her. They love her not.
Wilting away in the process. And then Mayzie gets to go home, but the daisy still notably pops up on occasion. This is so close to having a cohesive message. I mean, this could easily be a metaphor for anything that makes a child different that adults don't like. Autism, mental illnesses, an overactive imagination, I don't know, take your pick. But it doesn't quite get there, at least for me. Part of the problem was that Maisie's school and family were reacting pretty badly about the daisy. If they had that be part of the reason Mayzie signed with the executive guy, and also the reason she was scared to go home, that she genuinely thought her family wouldn't accept her with the daisy on her head, I think the story would be stronger. This is actually present in the 2016 version. The whole plot about her being famous is just straight up not there. So she runs away in tears specifically because of how everyone was treating her, and that she thinks her family doesn't love her anymore. However, in both versions, she loses the daisy before she goes home, so we don't actually get to see if her family would accept her with the daisy or not. So yeah, we don't really get a resolution to that. But the fact that the daisy keeps popping up after all of this, and Mayzie is adjusting to life with it, is a nice touch.
I am getting used to it.
So it's alright. It's nothing special and maybe needed another draft, but it's alright. And then there's that one other book. That one other book that's always left off of lists like these, but is spoken about in hushed whispers by the few who stumbled across it online. Dr. Seuss's Naked Woman book. Yeah, The Seven Lady Godivas was published in 1939, and for all intents and purposes is pretty obscure. People at the time found it offensive, and it just generally did not sell very well, so they stopped printing it. Huh. How about that? This also might have driven Dr. Seuss to only write children's books from then on. He very notably said, "I'd rather write for kids. They're more appreciative. Adults are obsolete children and the hell with them." And when he finally tried writing another adult book 50 years later, he called it You're Only Old Once, a book for obsolete children. They did print it again, though, once Dr. Seuss became a household name and people became fascinated by the fact that the Cat in the Hat guy drew a book full of naked ladies. Or maybe not, because Geisel later admitted to lying about the renewed interest, but nonetheless, it had a limited reprint in 1987. In fact, I was going to buy it for shits and giggles, but nope, that is not a thing that's going to happen. Fortunately, I found a PDF. So this is based on the legendary Lady Godiva, who rode a horse naked through the streets so her husband would lower taxes, and a man known as Peeping Tom, who looked at her and was instantly struck blind. In Seuss's version of events, there were actually 7 Lady Godivas, all sisters, and all of them are naked all the time, and they're actually engaged to the Peeping brothers. Yeah, so like, it's not just Peeping Tom, we also have Peeping Harry, Peeping Drexel, Peeping Dick. After their father is killed by a horse, the 7 sisters vow to not marry until they can learn a horse truth. And the rest of the book is just the ladies learning their individual horse truths, which turn out to be well-known horse-related expressions. So yeah, it's just a goofy spoof on a classic legend. A proto-Shrek, you might say. It's a cute enough book. You'd think it'd be scandalous based off of the naked ladies, and they are naked the entire time, by the way, but nah, they're not really sexualized. They don't even have nipples. It is a bit cruel to the overweight sister. She's too fat to ride a horse, and she gets her nose bitten off, but she also gets what she wants first, so I guess there's a trade-off there. I guess this leads credence to why all the recent Seuss adaptations have so many fat jokes.
Oh, look out below! Tommy's on board!
I don't know, man, but the female characters have actual agency in the story, and even though they all have the same goal, they all go about achieving it in different ways. So it's not ideal, but it's fine, I guess. It's funny, the first book and last book Seuss made, or apparently made, that featured female characters are pretty decent, but the ones in the middle? There are a few female characters scattered in besides the original Mayzie and Gertrude, but they're pretty far and in between, and most have reasons why they're female. They're either mothers or sisters, or in the case of Gertrude, their stories deal with themes of beauty and vanity, which are seen as female traits. Gertrude is even specifically introduced as a girl bird. The Horton Here's a Who animated short, which was written by Geisel, has a lot of female birds added into it, but their only purpose is to gossip.
Mrs. Tucanella said.
Very cruelly, too. Like, wow, the way they talk about mental illness in this short.
Horton's schizo-sophistic. In other words, he's cracked. Mrs. Tucanella told me that he's manic and depressive, retrogressive and recessive and...
Even in his later books, the Butter Battle book has female characters as cheerleaders, and You're Only Old Once has a female secretary, but also a female doctor, who seem to have been placed there specifically for a joke about her looking at his dick. Cindy Lou Who could technically be swapped out with a boy and it wouldn't change much, but Emily actually made the argument that Cindy Lou Who is probably a little girl because she needs to be the opposite of the Grinch in this scene. While he's a big, scary male monster, she's a tiny, innocent little girl. She's also a representation of innocence and purity, which is something usually assigned to female characters. Lurie was also right about how Seuss also had a whole subgenre of books whose entire plot is little white boy imagines weird and creative stuff. Actually, most of the books that got discontinued fall into that category, and it is almost always a little boy doing it, except for in one case. The Glunk That Got Funk, the one Dr. Seuss story that is actually about a little girl's imagination. The girl often sits around and imagines cute and fuzzy things, but one day she gets bored with the soft little things and decides to have some fun, accidentally imagining into existence the fearsome Glunk, who runs up the phone bill. Her brother shows up and helps her get rid of the Glunk, and then lectures her for her radical thinking and use of imagination, and she only ever thinks up cute little fuzzy things from then on. That is such a weird message for a kid's book, for a Dr. Seuss book no less, to limit your imagination. And for this being the one instance of a girl character being allowed to be imaginative, the fact that she's punished and then shamed for being imaginative and is forced to keep her ideas simple and palatable is unfortunate. Now, do I think that this makes Dr. Seuss a huge sexist? I don't know. I never met the man. I know how his first marriage ended. I've decided to not really comment on that because I try not to drag personal shit in my stupid kids book analyses. Fuck. And his first wife also did a lot of uncredited work on his early books, which sucks. But honestly, it's really not that unusual for authors to only put in female characters when it's absolutely necessary, especially with big casts of animals. I mean, I made that fucking cats video a little while ago, and I pointed out that T.S. Eliot only included 2 female characters in that entire book. I'm not counting the female names in the naming of cats. Those aren't characters. They're just names. One was a housewife sort, and the other was a love interest. Or even look at something like Winnie the Pooh. The only female character is Kanga, who is the mother to one of the other characters. Unless we count Darby, I guess. Yeah, honestly, it's not too unusual for people to see male as the standard and female as something special that needs to serve a purpose in the story. It's not something I like, but it's a blind spot, an unconscious bias that I'm sure most people don't realize they have. And it isn't all bad. I really do appreciate how there isn't really a big visual difference between the male and female characters, at least when it comes to the non-human ones. I mean, yes, sometimes he slaps a bow onto a girl creature just to make sure that we understand it's a girl, but the vast majority of the time they just look like animals. Gertrude and Mayzie don't have lips or hips or breasts. They just look like, well, birds. And the male characters have long eyelashes, which usually when it comes to children's illustrations are typically reserved only for female characters. The male characters are also allowed to be soft and gentle. Obviously not all of them, but Horton is basically a maternal figure in this introductory book, and it's presented as being this beautiful and wonderful thing. Some people interpret this story as being about Geisel himself, since he and his wife apparently couldn't have children, and the fact that the egg hatches out to look exactly like Horton might represent his wish to have biological children despite it being physically impossible. I honestly don't like making jumps like that because, again, stupid kids book analysis, and it was actually his first wife who wrote the ending to Horton hatches the egg. But it's really, really nice that the story is super pro-adoption. And it's genuinely really nice to see a male character whose main virtues are kindness, compassion, and gentleness. And despite the world literally trying to beat those virtues out of him, he holds on to and is even rewarded for having those virtues. If I was going to compare Horton to another character, it would probably be Ferdinand the Bull. They're both gentle giants who get forced into extremely cruel entertainment spectacles, who through their sheer kindness end up inexplicably getting sent home. The 2017 movie even has the thing where he changes the hearts and minds of the crowd and the people running the show.
Let him live!
I'm not accusing anyone of plagiarism or anything. I just really like these two guys. And yeah, it is completely absurd that the circus, which puts Horton on display because he was a freak of nature, would just return him to the jungle after he hatched an entirely new species. But isn't it also kind of beautiful that the crowd is just so moved by Horton's sacrifice and is so overjoyed that it worked out in his favor? Just the pure love Horton radiates is enough to sway an entire crowd of jeering assholes and the establishment who put him on display in the first place. Or that after the Who's prove that they exist, the other animals immediately do a 180 and pledge their lives to help Horton take care of them. He's just so nice. I love him. It isn't horribly unusual to see this expanded on, I guess you could say, an adaptation. The 1942 Merry Melodies adaptation of Horton Hatches the Egg, which is the very first Seuss adaptation ever made, by the way, turns Horton into this huge dopey idiot.
On a riddle and a thong. I still can't get the word to that thong.
And the 2008 Blue Sky Studio, rest in peace, adaptation of Horton Hears a Who turns him into a spastic weirdo.
This entire jungle is a house of death!
I guess these are probably the two character archetypes kids found funny in their respective time periods. I don't really hate either of these versions. Actually, I find the Merry Melodies Horton extremely endearing. But like, I do take some issue with the fact that the books go out of their way to show how aware Horton is about his size in relation to those he's protecting. And the words carefully, gently, and tenderly are often used to describe his movements.
You're okay!
I thought Seussical nailed it, honestly. He's just a really nice guy who gets way over his head, and they don't feel the need to add any more to him. I mean, maybe add more to the costume, other than just a gray shirt. Also, yes, that is Bertram. I know you were wondering, and there's your answer.
Did you know dust can get under furniture? This job is impossible.
But if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty of gentle giant characters written by Dr. Seuss, we have to talk about Thidwick the Big-Hearted Moose. Why does no one ever talk about Thidwick the Big-Hearted Moose? I want to talk about Thidwick the Big-Hearted Moose. I'm going to dedicate an entire part of this video to nothing but Thidwick the Big-Hearted Moose. Get hyped for that. Also, content warning for animal death? No, seriously. Thidwick is a moose who lives in a herd with a bunch of other moose, and one day a bug asks if he could ride on his antlers, and Thidwick's like, sure, no problem. And then the bug starts to invite other animals to ride along too, and it gets pretty crowded. Then the other moose are like, hey, this is kind of weird and gross. We can't let you stay with us if they're all on your antlers, but Thidwick is too nice and polite to evict them, so he's forced to leave the herd. And then winter comes, and all the moss the moose eats dies. So Thidwick is going to cross the lake to look for food, but the animals living on his antlers don't want to live on that side of the lake, so they force him to stay. And then hunters show up, and Thidwick can't escape because all of the extra weight on his head. But then, fortunately, it's molting season, so his antlers fall off, and he jumps into the lake and swims over and reunites with his friends. And all of the animals who had taken advantage of Thidwick are shot, stuffed, and hung up on the wall. If this all sounds familiar, that's because it's almost the exact same plot of the beloved classic story Horton and the Quagger Bug. I mean, obviously, Thidwick has a lot more plot points, but the same basic structure is the same. I'd be willing to guess this started out as a really early draft of Thidwick. The ending is way less gruesome though. The asshole bug ends up getting sneezed away, not shot to death and hung up on the wall. They stuffed a spider? Aside from being a nightmarish way to end your cute little moose book, it also frames the story really bizarrely. Just from me describing the plot, you'd probably expect that the moral here would be to not be a doormat, to figure out at what point you need to stop being polite and actually stand up for yourself. And Thidwick gets disrespected to an absolutely ridiculous degree. A bird rips his hair out of his head and builds a nest out of it. And then a woodpecker pecks holes into his antlers, and a family of squirrels move in. Then his guests doom him to starvation by forcing him to stay on the side of the lake with no food on it. At this point, his guests have made it very, very clear that they'd rather he die than make them even slightly uncomfortable, and he just accepts his fate. Despite him fully having the ability to just walk across the lake no matter what they say, he doesn't, because he doesn't want to upset his guests. The worst part about all this, though, is that the book justifies it. No, seriously, it stops dead in the middle just to explain to the reader that Thidwick has done nothing wrong. You couldn't say scat cause that wouldn't be right. You couldn't shout scram cause that isn't polite. A host has to put up with all kinds of pests, for a host above all must be nice to his guests. So you try hard to smile and you try to look sweet and you go right on looking for moose moss to eat. That happens in Horton and the Quaggerbug too, that the story grinds to a halt to justify Horton being a doormat. I'm not crazy, right? This is the same story, right? But okay, you might be saying, this doesn't actually mean anything. After all, the story might change its stance on this when the stakes get raised. But no, not really. When the hunters come by, he can't escape because of the huge amount of weight on his head, and the only reason he doesn't die is because it just so happens to be molting season. He got lucky. And yes, he did make the decision to take his antlers off. And yes, that is probably supposed to be him standing up for himself. But it is still shirking the responsibility to a certain extent. The animals specifically lived on his antlers. Well, on his horns. The book calls them horns. Dr. Seuss didn't seem to know what antlers were, except for this one part at the beginning, but whatever. They made their home on his antlers, and otherwise barely acknowledged his existence at all unless he did something they didn't like. So him throwing his antlers off isn't technically evicting them, it's just removing himself from the equation. It's like if someone came into your apartment and refused to leave, and then a serial killer broke in and you gave the keys to your guest and just kinda left. Sure, you're leaning into the karma there a little bit, but you could hardly call that standing up for yourself. The animals would have died regardless of if Thidwick's antlers were attached to his head or not, and he would have absolutely died there along with them if he didn't realize there was a way to get rid of his guests without having to evict them right at that exact moment. He found a loophole where he didn't actually have to stand up for himself, and he took it. So what exactly is supposed to be the moral here? Well, maybe there just isn't one. Geisel famously said in a 1959 interview with Life magazine, "Kids can see a moral coming a mile off and they gag at it. But there's an inherent moral in any story." For example, Geisel reportedly didn't find The Grinch a particularly hard book to write. It was actually heavily based off of a terrible Christmas he had the year before, and he put a bit of himself in the story when the Grinch says that he's been putting up with Christmas for 53 years. Geisel was 53 when he wrote The Grinch. So the story came out easily enough, but he ended up having an extremely hard time figuring out how to end it. I got hung up getting the Grinch out of the mess. I got into a situation where I sounded like a second-rate preacher or some biblical truism. Finally, in desperation, without making any statement whatever, I sewed the Grinch and the Who's together at the table and made a pun of the Grinch carving the roast beast. I had gone through thousands of religious choices, and then after 3 months it came out like that. Now this isn't to say that Geisel was against putting theming and messaging into his stories, because obviously, even if he ended up not having the Grinch give a big grand speech at the end about what he had learned, the Grinch does still go through an arc. In the beginning, he hates Christmas traditions, and at the end, he's leading the Christmas traditions. And the realization he has that triggers this change is all the reader needs to understand what's being said. Same basic idea with the arc the animals go through in Horton Hears a Who. Hell, sometimes you don't need an arc. Sometimes a character sticking to their morals is all you really need. Horton makes a promise to Mayzie, and he sticks to that promise despite getting mocked, threatened, kidnapped, all sorts of terrible things. He is absolutely being taken advantage of, just like Thidwick was, and he doesn't stick up for himself either. What's notable though is that Horton gets rewarded in the end. He is the one who sits on the egg, so the baby bird turns out looking exactly like him. We get a reaction from Mayzie. She's clearly unhappy that she didn't get what she wanted, but that's completely brushed over. I mean, she's just shoved off into the corner here. The real focus is on Horton and the elephant bird and how happy they are. This is the culmination of Horton's good morals. This is his reward. Thidwick, on the other hand, does not get any kind of reward. Yeah, he doesn't die, but look where he ends up, on the other side of the lake, eating moss with his friends. This is exactly where he'd be if none of that antler nonsense ever happened. He sticks to his morals, and he just goes back to the status quo like nothing ever happened. But that's not where this book ends, is it? No, the last image we see is of the animals who knowingly mutilated and starved someone who had been nothing but kind and gracious towards them, who they forced against his will into a situation where they were all put into danger, hanging up dead on the wall. This is the combination of the cruel behavior they showed throughout the entire book. This is their punishment. So if Thidwick the big-hearted moose has any kind of lesson to teach, it's that if you take advantage of someone's kindness, you're the scum of the earth and you deserve to die. So, this is my favorite Dr. Seuss book. The ending just, completely caught me off guard. I feel like the man has a reputation for making fun, whimsical, lighthearted stories, but they could definitely be dark and mean at times too. He has plenty of stories that don't have happy endings, that feature characters who don't learn their lesson, at least not till it's too late. One that always stuck with me was the Zacks, who refused to step out of each other's way and ended up not being able to move for, probably the rest of their lives, if I were to guess.
And they built it right over those two stubborn Zacks and left them there, standing unbudged in their tracks.
Most famously is the Lorax, which I distinctly remember being read to me when I was in 2nd grade, and it wrecked me. It actually inspired my friend and I to bring in bags and go around the playground during recess picking up trash. We got in trouble for that. Like, the school called our parents to make sure it wouldn't happen again, and then not too long after that, a bunch of the trees behind the school started to get chopped down, and when I expressed how wrong I thought that was, my mom and teacher were like, "What? Aren't you excited? We're getting a new soccer field." And then when I was like, "But there's already a soccer field right there," they didn't want to talk about it anymore. Are we ever going to have a discussion about how we instill certain values into children and then immediately beat those values out of them? Or... So in case you've never heard of it, the Lorax is a story in which an old recluse called the Wudsler recounts how he chopped out every single truffula tree in order to create a product called a Thneed. A little forest sprite known as the Lorax tried to stop the Wudsler, but was unable to do so. The book ends with the Wudsler giving the last truffula seed to the child who listened to his story, urging him to regrow the trees. Now, the Lorax is definitely one of the most well-known Dr. Seuss properties, and typically the one people turn to when discussing the politics in his stories. It has been talked about to death by all sorts of people, especially in regards to what a failure the 2012 adaptation was. I hadn't watched this version until making this video, and yeah, not a fan.
You wouldn't hit a woman. That's a woman?
My sister actually watched it when she was 12, and she is super smug about the fact that she didn't end up with a thing for the Wudsler. But I can't really blame anyone who did. There is so much Wudsler apologia in this thing. Like, way too much Wudsler apologia. Is that how that word is pronounced? It was definitely too afraid to have the Wudsler be a pure antagonist. It does everything it can to make him into an innocent who's just way over his head and doesn't think through his actions. First off, they make him oblivious. They foreshadow this early on by having him be unaware of how close he came to skewering the animals.
Dreams come true. Come on.
And then we see his aunt sweeping away the barbaloots behind his back, which he doesn't appear to notice. And then he doesn't realize how much destruction he caused until after the last tree falls. The 2012 movie originally had a pretty intense rock opera to explore the Wudsler's decline, a decline in which he actually showed some awareness of his actions. But I guess that was too much for a kid's movie or whatever because it got replaced with a much more poppy tune specifically about how oblivious he is.
How bad can I be? How bad can I possibly be?
Now, this isn't to say that the 2012 movie didn't have good ideas. One thing that immediately stood out to me was that the Onceler actually starts off just harvesting the tufts in the movie. He chops down one tree, promises not to do it again.
I hereby swear that I will never chop down another tree.
And then just picks the tufts off the tree. Which, yeah, that makes sense. You don't chop down a whole apple tree just to get the apples. And maybe it's supposed to be implied that the Onceler was too impatient to do it like that, but neither the book nor the original short ever actually address it. The movie not only shows that there was a way to make the Thneeds without hurting the environment, but also shows that doing it like this is much, much slower, which is such a good idea. And if they had followed through with this, they could have shown the Onceler grow impatient with how slow his company was growing, so he decided to start cutting down trees just to speed things along, and then have things spiral from there. That could have been a cool statement on how companies cut corners to increase profits and how decisions like that put everyone at risk. But instead...
Well, and this just came to me. We could always start chopping down the trees.
Yeah, we can't have the guy who ruined everything make a personal decision for his own company. He has to have his asshole mother pressuring him to do bad things.
But...
No buts, Oncey. You're running a business now. You have to do what's best for the company and your mama.
But even worse than all that is that the core of the story has been destroyed in the name of being marketable. One thing that is really, really important about the Lorax is how gradual it is. It takes a long time for the environment to be completely destroyed, and there are a lot of signs leading up to it that the Onceler is reaching the point of no return. And it's impossible for the Onceler to miss these signs because the Lorax shoves every single one of them in his face. First, the Barbaloots leave due to starvation, then the Swabby Swans due to air pollution, then the Hummingfish due to water pollution. And the Onceler watches this all happen right in front of him, over and over and over again, but he still chooses to continue what he's doing. But in the movie, not only do the animals leave all at the same time, but they leave after it's too late for the Onceler to decide to stop. Also, it seemed to have missed that the entire point of the Hummingfish walking was that the water was so polluted that they had to walk on land to get away from it. Like, it was supposed to be kind of shocking seeing dying fish walk out of the water like that. It wasn't. They weren't walking on land the entire time. It kind of takes away the impact. Seeing the animals all go off one by one is actually pretty important to the Onceler's character because it shows that he is able to watch all this suffering, all these atrocities happening one by one, and just shrug it off and continue on as normal. Hell, his entire bickering speech doesn't happen until after the Hummingfish, the last animal to leave the valley, has gone. Even after witnessing every single animal flee the valley, he still insists on continuing as normal. No, actually on increasing production, on making more Thneeds than ever before, on growing and growing and growing.
I'm figuring on biggering, and biggering, and biggering, and biggering, turning more truculent trees into Thneeds.
Until suddenly reality snaps him back. The illusion of never-ending economic growth is broken. His business literally relied on the truculent trees, a natural resource that he took no care to preserve. Now with all of them gone, he can't make Thneeds, which means he can't make money. And neither can anyone else for that matter. The people leave the valley too, in a manner that somewhat visually resembles the other animals. Without jobs, they can't survive there, so they have to go. And this is the moment the Onceler has realized he's gone too far. Not when he chased out all the local wildlife and made the surrounding area inhabitable. No, it takes for his wallet to be affected for him to finally realize he's made a terrible mistake. But do you know what's wild? The Onceler didn't learn his lesson. He's still a capitalist. He isn't just telling his story to whoever happens to be walking by. No, he makes you pay for it. And this just isn't something that's mentioned in 1 or 2 lines. This transaction goes on for several pages. The Wunsler counts to make sure you paid him the correct amount, and he talks into a tube so only the person who paid for the story gets to hear it. Despite everything, he's still using the truffula trees to make a profit. But at the end of the book, he gives the child the last truffula seed. He doesn't charge him or ask for anything in return. He just gives the truffula seed away for free. This is the first time in the entire story where the Wunsler chooses not to exploit the truffula trees for profit. And it shows that he's finally grown as a person and is making amends. Well, barely making amends. It's not like he plants the seed himself. He just pawns it off on some kid. But this makes perfect sense within the context of the theming. I mean, the people who actually cause the destruction are never actually the ones to fix their mistakes. No, it falls onto the next generation to clean up their mess. This idea of children being the catalyst for change is present in Horton Hears a Who too. I mean, the Who's movement to prove their own humanity is only able to succeed once the youth joins in. His voice is the one to finally push them over the top. And the little kangaroo, who up to this point has mimicked everything hateful his mother has said, not only has a change of attitude when she does, but also ends up surpassing her. The book literally ends with his final monologue dedicating himself to the cause. The child in the Lorax has a real uphill battle too. The Wunsler tells him to give the seed clean water and feed it fresh air. Where? The book literally shows that the Wunsler ruined both the water and the air quality. And this isn't the 2012 movie where the town that the kid is from has great air quality and, okay, well, the water's still pretty bad. But in the book, you can see that the town where the kid comes from is in the background, and it's just as dreary and smog-filled as the rest of the valley. Now, maybe this is me reading too much into the moral here, but I don't know. Geisel's other books show that doing the right thing is hard. Horton and Thidwick are both presented as having the moral high ground, and they get that shit beaten out of them constantly. And the 1972 short, which was also written by Geisel, adds this line.
It takes 10 months for a truffula seed to germinate. It takes 10 long years before the seed grows into a sapling.
It's not canon to the book, of course, but it shows that regrowing the truffula trees is a long, hard process. And even if you manage to do that, that kid's going to be babysitting that little sprout for what, 20 or so years? And then when he finally gets more truffula seeds from the new tree, it'll be another few decades before the forest finally grows back. This was probably the part that irked me the most about the 2012 Lorax adaptation. Why is it so easy to just regrow all the truffula trees? I mean, yes, they don't have to make it take several decades like in the short, but literally within an hour of, no, not even planting the damn things, just some water spills on it, and it's already blossoming. That was something that bothered me about the 2008 Horton Hears a Who adaptation too. In the book, it's pretty much understood that Horton is going to be taking care of the Who's for his entire life, and that's why the other animals volunteering to help him means so much, because they're also pledging their lives to support this marginalized group. And this makes sense. Allyship isn't something you do once, it's something you have to keep up with. But in the 2008 movie, Horton just decides that the Who's will be safe on this mountain.
There he knew every Who would be safe, would be sound.
And then leaves them there. It's a complete lack of commitment. The sour kangaroo isn't pledging her life to help a community of people she was formerly oppressing. She's just taking a short walk. We don't even see them reach the mountain. Like, come on now. And I won't lie, my inner child was so happy seeing all these baby truffula trees poking out everywhere and the Lorax coming back.
You done good, Beanpole. You done good.
Like I said, the end of this book completely wrecked me as a child, but that was also why it was so effective. Most, if not all, environmental stories for kids showed the world healing and getting better to a certain extent by the end. I remember fully expecting my teacher to just turn the page and show us the kid watering a little truffula tree or something, but no, it just ended. There's no closure, no happy, easy-to-digest ending. This thing slams reality down on you and does not give you an easy way out. When the Onceler is speaking to the child at the end, saying, unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better, it's not, he's directly addressing the reader. If you want a happy ending for this story, you have to make it. The movie has no such call to action, and it's a little sad to see just how easy it presents fixing the environment is. The Lorax is one of the most honest environmental messages out there. It straight up tells kids that you can advocate for the environment all you want, that you can fight and protest until the bitter end, and that it won't do anything. The Lorax is riding the Onceler's ass from the second he chops out his first tree to the moment the last tree falls, and it doesn't affect anything. I feel like there is a misconception that the child goes to visit the Onceler because he wants to learn about what happened to the trees. Probably because that's how the 2012 movie chooses to frame it.
People say that if someone brings you this stuff, that you'll tell them about trees!
Or, more accurately, the girl the child has a crush on likes trees.
So if, say, I'm just thinking out loud here, if a guy somehow got you one...
Well, I'd probably marry him on the spot.
Which is super chill and great. Okay.
Because unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, it's a girl, isn't it?
But no. In the book, the child wants to know what happened to the Lorax. What was the Lorax, and why was it there? And why was it lifted and taken somewhere from the far end of town where the grickle grass grows? The old Onceler still lives there. Ask him. He knows. The question of why the Lorax was lifted away and who did it is presented at the very beginning of the book. And when we're finally introduced to the Lorax himself, he's presented as a spokesperson for the environment. He shows up the first time the Onceler damages the environment, and comes back every single time some part of the environment is completely destroyed, and he is forced to send off one of the native species. And finally, the last tree falls, and the Lorax, whose entire purpose in life was to speak for the trees, and the animals who rely on them, suddenly has nothing. And with nothing left to protect, no purpose on this earth anymore, he lifts himself away. And the very last line of the entire book is the Onceler expressing hope that someday the environment might be healed enough that the Lorax and his friends might come back. So the tragedy of the Lorax isn't that all the trees are cut down, it's that someone who really loved and cared about the trees and all the creatures who relied on them failed in protecting them. The modern environmentalist movement as we know it started in the late 60s, early 70s, not long before the Lorax was published, and was fueled by a few notable disasters. Pesticides causing the shells of bald eagle eggs to fin and break, oil spills off the coast of California, and Lake Erie and its connected waterways were so polluted that they literally caught fire. And it apparently wasn't the first time either. Here's a photo from an earlier fire in 1952. And we know that the Lorax was somewhat inspired by this movement because the book called out Lake Erie specifically.
I hear things are just as bad up in Lake Eerie.
However, after a huge effort was made to clean up the lake, 2 students wrote to Dr. Seuss asking him to remove the line.
They wrote to Dr. Seuss and suggested that it was no longer appropriate to have the line in there about, I hear things are just as bad up in Lake Erie.
And he agreed, taking the line out in 1986.
On Dr. Seuss' letterhead, written from La Jolla, California on January 27, 1986. Dear Claudia Moliere and Margie Pless, although I will be unable to accept your kind invitation to come to Cleveland, I do agree with you that my 1971 statement in the Lorax about the condition of Lake Erie needs a bit of revision.
Oh, wow. An aspect of a Dr. Seuss book that was a product of its time but was removed after some members of the public pointed out it no longer applied in the modern age. Cancel culture has gone too far.
I can assure you the process of purifying my text will commence immediately.
The name dropping of Lake Erie is the rare moment where Dr. Seuss says exactly what he's writing about directly in the text. However, there are still other Dr. Seuss stories that are directly based off of a specific person or event. Yertle the Turtle is the king of the pond. He kind of works by Lion King logic, in that everything he sees is his kingdom. Problem is that Yertle is small and can't see anything outside the pond, So one day he orders a few turtles to stack up so he can sit on top of them and see farther out. And this satisfies him for a while, till he decides to expand his kingdom, and orders more and more turtles to stack up for him. Meanwhile, the turtles doing the actual work to elevate him are suffering. They're literally starving to death, and the ones at the bottom especially are in terrible pain. But Yertle doesn't care. He sees the moon and is offended that something dare be higher than him, so he's about to order over 5,000 more turtles to stack up for him, when the little turtle at the very bottom does something lewd and disrespectful, and it's enough to topple the whole structure, dethroning Yertle and freeing the pond from his tyranny. Okay, so obviously this story is about abuse of power and standing up for your rights. It isn't exactly subtle about that. The little turtle at the bottom goes off about how they should all have rights. Yertle's entire empire was literally built on the backs of his own people, specifically by exploiting and abusing them so that he could have more perceived power. And the people very easily take the power back from him when his abuse goes too far. Seuss has written other stories with a similar theme to this one. King Louis Katz features a king who doesn't want his tail to drag on the ground, so he forces another cat to carry it for him. That cat also forces another cat to carry his tail, and then that cat forces a cat to carry his tail, and so on and so forth, until the last cat in line realizes that there isn't anyone left to carry his tail, so he throws down the tail he's carrying and announces that he quits, which causes all the other cats holding up tails to do the same, until the king's tail is dragging on the ground again. So again, we see the one citizen at the very bottom standing up for himself, and it being enough to destroy the current system. Granted, this one has a few major differences to Yertle. It shows a kind of hierarchy forming in society as the citizens scramble to not be the one on the bottom, and it actually ends with a new system forming as a result of the revolt, with the citizens becoming oh, come on. But Yertle the Turtle is definitely the standout of the two, at least for me, specifically for one really interesting reason. It's based off of the rise of Hitler. No, seriously. I couldn't draw Hitler as a turtle, Geisel said later, though for a moment he considered drawing Yertle with a familiar Hitler mustache before deciding it was gilding the lily a bit. Instead, I drew him as King whatever his name was, King of the Pond. He wanted to be king as far as he could see, so he kept piling them up. He conquered Central Europe and France, and there it was. Then I had this great pileup, and I said, how do you get rid of this imposter? What brought down despots? Ted decided it was the voice of the people. I said, well, I'll just simply have the guy at the bottom burp. Never was the precarious foundation on which Facet's build made so successfully literal. Then when Mac, the turtle at the bottom of the turtle pile, burped loudly, sending the stack of turtles tumbling and plunging Yertle into the mud. So, yeah, no getting around that. Here's a blatantly political message from Dr. Seuss that was a straight-up allegory for a real-life tyrannical dictator. Some years later, in 1972, Geisel wrote a book called Marvin K. Mooney, Will You Please Go Now? About a year later, Geisel sent a copy of the book to his friend, Art Buchwald, with the name Marvin K. Mooney crossed out and replaced with Richard M. Nixon. This was when Nixon was in the process of getting impeached, by the way. Buchwald was apparently delighted by this, and with Geisel's permission, rewrote the entire book to have Nixon's name, and printed the whole thing in the Washington Post. But the absolute height of Geisel using his books to take a political stance happened about a decade later. The Butter Battle book, released in 1984, was one of the last books Dr. Seuss ever wrote. Unless you want to count the thousands of books that came out after his death. It opens with a grandfather taking his grandson to visit a wall. On the other side of the wall lives a group of people called the Zooks. The grandfather and his grandson, on the other hand, are Ukes. The Ukes butter their bread butter side up, and the Zooks butter their bread butter side down. These two groups have been seemingly always at conflict, and the grandfather explains that when he was a young man, his weapon of choice, a switch made from a branch, was destroyed by a Zook slingshot. So the Ukes responded by making a bigger and more powerful slingshot, and the Zooks responded to that by making a slingshot even bigger and more powerful, and then the Ukes responded by making a gun. Yeah, this continues on for a while, till the Ukes create a little bomb that will blow up the entirety of the Zook town, and brings his grandson to the wall to watch him do it. However, when they get there, they discover a Zook with a bomb of his own, ready to destroy the Uke town, and both men are stuck holding their respective bombs, as the grandson worries about who will be the first one to drop theirs. "Be patient," said Grandpa. "We'll see. We will see." So this is about the Cold War, right? The wall between the Ukes and the Zooks gave me Berlin Wall vibes, and even just the concept of two groups trying to amass the more powerful weapon and straight up threatening to blow each other up is, well, it's not subtle. Geisel was generally pretty negative on the Cold War, and according to Morgan & Morgan, thought that Reagan was making things worse. "I'm not anti-military," he said. "I'm just anti-crazy. We did the same thing in World War I and World War II. Why can't we learn?" And that is extremely evident in the story. He has both sides looking exactly alike, aside from the colors of their clothing. The only difference between them is the way they butter their bread. It's a petty, stupid reason that they take very, very seriously. The grandfather says that the Zooks have kinks in their souls. There were big propaganda posters plastered around. The animated short, created by Ralph Batsky, because of course, actually added a scene where the children are shown in school pledging allegiance to the way they butter bread.
"I do solemnly swear to spread up on top here and never down there."
Which, I mean, as a child that grew up in the American school system, yeah, I felt a certain way about this. This book was apparently a project Geisel was extremely passionate about. He told his nephew he was working 8 to 10 hours a day on the best book he's ever written, and he was pretty defensive of it, refusing to change anything. His publishers and editors didn't like the title, the cover, the fact that the story starts in the past tense and slowly shifts into the present, which, if you allow me to, I would like to defend. The beginning of the story is set up like the grandfather is reliving old memories, like he's reminiscing on a war he fought in his youth, but then all of a sudden it catches up to the present and it's like, holy shit, the grandfather took the kid here so he could watch him blow up an entire group of people. Like, holy fuck. Plus, the detail of the battle starting when the grandfather was a young man and continuing on through his entire life is very apt commentary. At the time this book was written, the Cold War had been going on for almost 40 years. That's more than enough time for a young soldier to grow old and become a grandparent. And the ending. The ending caused a lot of problems. Morgan & Morgan say that this was the first time in memory editors questioned a Dr. Seuss text. It was called Bleak, too scary for children. Someone suggested he change it so it has a happy ending. And I do understand. The book is still perfectly child-friendly, like it never shows anything particularly violent, and the bomb is called a bitchy big boy boomaroo, which is a very cutesy-ass name. But it's still referred to as a bomb. And even calling it a big boy is extremely reminiscent of the names of the two atom bombs that were dropped on Japan, Fat Man and Little Boy. And it's honestly kind of jarring how seriously the story takes the bomb. Like, up until the end, it's kind of like fun and games. Oh, haha, this machine sprays blue goo all over the Zooks. Here's a bomb, go blow them up. The Yooks even send their own citizens to shelter underground, because the bomb is just so powerful it will apparently kill them too. Which also kind of gives me the vibe that Grandpa was sent on a suicide mission, and that he just brought his grandson along to die with him. For their country, of course. If the Yooks are so concerned that dropping the bomb on the Zook side of the wall will kill them too, then it doesn't really matter who drops their bomb. Both sides are completely fucked. Whoever wins, we lose. Am I right, ladies? And this also just might be a coincidence, but I noticed it, and this is my video, so I can say whatever I want. Yooks and Zooks rhymes with nukes. Literary analysis with grace. Geisel refused every single piece of criticism he received about this book. This was a message he wanted to put out into the world completely uncensored. This was something he cared about very, very deeply, and eventually he got his way. The book was published in 1984 with his exact vision, and the public's response was, well. Okay, so I have a confession to make. This whole entire fucking movie I just made wasn't made for social justice reasons or anything like that. No, I tricked you. This is another freakishly long redemption arc I'm making for purely selfish reasons. This is becoming a thing, whether I like it or not. See, this may surprise you, but this YouTube channel has actually been around a while. That's why the URL is, yeah. I made this channel as a child. I used to make dumbass little animations, all private now, and my first kinda analysis-styled thing was a short, ranty thing I made after I saw my sister's high school production of Seussical the musical.
My sister was in the backstage crew of Seussical the musical at our local high school, so I'm gonna talk about that.
I had graduated like a week before, and I was bored at home, and as time went on, I kind of decided that being nitpicky about something as harmless as Seussical the musical is pretty pathetic.
I'm a little confused on if the cat in the hat's supposed to be real.
So, it's unlisted now. But this whole Seuss controversy made me suddenly flash back in 2018, and I started listening to the Seussical soundtrack while I was at work, and then suddenly the thought, Seussical the musical is just a less horny version of Cats, popped into my head. And then I fell down a rabbit hole, and now here we are. Okay, so I feel like that needs some explanation. So both musicals are a collection of children's poems and stories that were all written by the same guy, but are otherwise unrelated, stitched together in an attempt to make a plot with the songs mostly consisting of the existing poetry.
But when the day's hustle and bustle is done, then the Gumby Cat's work is but hardly begun.
I'll help you,
said Horton.
But who are you and where?
He looked and he looked, he could see nothing there.
Seussical is much more successful in creating a cohesive narrative than Cats. In fact, Cats doesn't really have a plot. I made a video about this. But while there is a story happening throughout, it's mostly just 3 hours of the cat singing about how cool they are, and that's kinda it. Seussical, on the other hand, 100% has a plot, and it's nice and clean and easy to follow. However, Seussical has to literally bend the characters into cliche molds in order to get the story to work. Gertrude McFuzz, who I think was supposed to be a teenager in the book. I don't have a lot of evidence for that, it's just a vibe I got. But she's now Horton's love interest. And that kid from Horton Hears a Who whose yell is enough to get the jungle animals to hear him, well, he's the mayor's son now.
Who's there?
It's me, Jojo, the mayor's son.
Yeah, the 2008 movie didn't invent that. And now he has this whole story where his parents don't like how imaginative he is, and they just want him to conform.
Stop telling such outlandish tales.
Stop turning minnows into whales.
Now take your bath and go to bed.
And think some normal things instead.
But then only him and his imagination can think of the perfect word to save the day.
Jojo! Think of something!
They frame him just yelling out a nonsense word as his imagination saving the town.
The fate of the Who's rested squarely on him. But then came a think, a peculiar new word no one ever had heard.
When the entire point of this moment was that it doesn't matter how small you are, you can make a difference. The word itself didn't matter, the fact that he was making his voice heard at all did. But here it is getting all the focus.
Their troubles were ended. They hailed his great yeah! And Jojo was honored as thinker non-stop.
And that kinda takes away from the messaging of the original. Yertle the Turtle is a judge.
Judge Yertle the Turtle presiding everyone!
But no mention about how he was literally a Hitler allegory, even though him being in a position of power might be of concern, maybe that's a thing they should explore, but nope. The butter battle is going on, but now it's literally just about butter.
Thing we trust on this fragile speck of dust is eating red butter side up.
Butter side up?
And as for those who like their butter down, we'll nucleate them.
The Sneetches get mentioned in one line.
Sneetches on beaches!
The Lorax story gets a brief mention, but that is immediately brushed over.
The Trophula trees were all cut down, but that's another story.
Yes, I know it had an entire number at one point.
Horton was there, Gertrude was there, Mayzie was here. The only thing that was not smushed together and was the same from beginning to end was this book.
And from what I found of it, it sounds like it was really cool.
Chug, chug, chug-a-chiggity, chug, chop, 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 nip, 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 nip.
But it's gone now, and it's almost kind of jarring how they just changed the entire tone of the Who song just to reference it.
Heaven on earth isn't heaven on Who.
The Trophula trees were all cut down.
A lot of the nuance and interest those original stories and characters had just aren't there in the musical. Cats, on the other hand, doesn't try to constrain any of the characters to typical archetypes. They just kinda let the characters be who they are. Now, of course, that comes at the expense of the story, but I guess those are the two ways you could do this kind of adaptation. You either have to squeeze the life out of your properties to get them to fit cleanly into one cohesive narrative, or you could just throw them together and let them run wild. And I prefer Cats' take on it personally. Like, say what you want about Cats, but at least you can't say it's less interesting than its source material. There, I did it. I redeemed myself. Next one up is the Harper's Island video. Do not watch it. But Seussical is definitely not the only one guilty of watering down Dr. Seuss over the years. I feel like society has been doing that for a while. Dr. Seuss is, to a lot of people, a representation of innocence and childhood and whimsy. He's like this mythological figure who everyone knew and respected, and his work always felt like it was there. It was so embedded into the lexicon that it's hard to imagine that there was ever a time when it didn't exist.
Waiting for time to see if we can really run on
Did you know he might have invented the word nerd? The first known usage of it was in If I Ran the Zoo, though it didn't have the meaning we associate with it today. It was just one of the creature names. I was completely floored to find out he died only 5 years before I was born. It feels like he's from a completely different time period. Hell, it almost feels like he wasn't even a person. I didn't know what he looked like as a child. He just was this goofy name on the cover of goofy books who represented himself with a cat. And I think that's how a lot of people remember him. And when the Seuss estate, the very people in charge of Dr. Seuss's image, pointed out that maybe the man wasn't perfect and had done some stuff he shouldn't, people were offended. One person I know in real life, when I asked them how they felt about this whole thing, told me, you know, the Nazis burned books too. As if that's even remotely comparable. As if you can't just go onto Amazon and buy these supposed banned books completely legally. And if you don't want to shell out $80 for a children's book, there are plenty of read-alongs on YouTube or PDFs floating around on the internet. And to be completely fair, there were also a handful of other incidents even before the official announcement. Joe Biden didn't mention Dr. Seuss's name on Read Across America Day, which I guess is unheard of.
And every year, the president mentions Dr. Seuss, because, again, it's his birthday. That's the whole point of it. Joe Biden omitted Dr. Seuss from this year's proclamation. Why? Because Dr. Seuss is now considered a racist.
However, mentioning Dr. Seuss on Read Across America Day was apparently a tradition that Obama started and Trump continued on with. So, I mean, whatever. It's like a 10-year-old tradition. Like, who cares? There were also a lot of reports that a school district in Virginia had banned Dr. Seuss books.
Cancel culture is now going after one of America's favorite children's books, schools in Virginia's Loudoun County, removing Dr. Seuss books from its annual Read Across America event, citing, quote, strong racial undertones.
When in reality, they just decided to not tie Read Across America Day and Dr. Seuss together. Instead, using the day to explore all sorts of books by all sorts of authors. No books got banned. Dr. Seuss's books are literally still available for the students to read.
However, Dr. Seuss books will still be available in libraries and classrooms in the district.
I also saw it mentioned that back in 2017, a Cambridge librarian refused a donation of Geisel's books that had been sent by Melania Trump. Although one quick read-through shows that while racism does come up, it's mostly to do with the fact that Cambridge is an extremely well-funded school district and didn't need the books. Like, the Trump administration was sending out books to one of the highest achieving schools in every state. Schools that probably already have the money and resources to get their own books. The librarian saw the donation as performative and didn't want anything to do with it. My students have access to a school library with over 9,000 volumes and a librarian with a graduate degree in library science. Meanwhile, school libraries around the country are being shuttered. Cities like Philadelphia, Chicago, and Detroit are suffering through expansion, privatization, and school choice, with no interest in outcomes of children, their families, their teachers, and their schools. Are those kids any less deserving of books simply because of circumstances beyond their control? Why not go out of your way to gift books to underfunded and underprivileged communities that continue to be marginalized and maligned by policies put in place by Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos? Why not reflect on those high standards of excellence beyond only what the numbers suggest? Secretary DeVos would do well to scaffold and lift schools instead of punishing them with closures and slashed budgets. It is kind of insane how protective people are over these books, but it's because Dr. Seuss is a childhood icon. Hell, one can even make the case he's an American icon, since there's an entire American holiday based around his legacy. And people who care a lot about American culture don't like it when you point out that there might be some rotten bits mixed in there. But Dr. Seuss wasn't just a childhood icon, a representation of all things imagination and whimsy, deeply ingrained into American culture. He was a real flesh and blood person. He had a name, a face, a messy personal life, beliefs, biases, and prejudices, and he had politics, some of which changed over the course of his life and some of which didn't. But the people who were the loudest in defending the honor of Dr. Seuss don't care about the actual person behind the pseudonym. Hell, most people don't even pronounce the pseudonym correctly. It's Seuss. Dr. Seuss. I'm not kidding. It was his middle name, his mother's maiden name. It's German and it's pronounced like Seuss. You're wrong as the deuce and you shouldn't rejoice. If you're calling him Seuss, he pronounces it Seuss. Seussical the musical. And I'm not saying someone's a hypocrite or a liar if they say they like these books but pronounce it like Seuss, but it just goes to show how far removed people's perception of this author and the actual person behind him actually are. I'd even bet that the people who were leading the charge against cancel culture to protect the name of Dr. Seuss don't even care about his books. Not really. Because a lot of people who were white knighting for Dr. Seuss earlier this year would, if the Lorax was published for the first time today, slam it for being SJW leftist propaganda and say that Dr. Seuss is a shill for Big Green. Fracking is good, actually. Actually, that's not even a hypothetical. When the 2012 adaptation came out, Dan Gaynor, the head of the conservative content analysis organization, said, "I don't want the moron writers of the Lorax trying to indoctrinate children and turn them into millions of little eco-warriors. Who appointed them in that role?" And Fox Business Network host Lou Dobbs said this about the movie.
Hollywood is once again trying to indoctrinate our children. 2 new films out this year, plainly with an agenda, plainly demonizing the so-called 1% and espousing the virtue of green energy policies, come what may. The movie, set to be released nationwide next month, is about a woodland creature who speaks for the trees and fights rampant industrialism. So where have we all heard this before? Occupy Wall Street forever trying to pit the makers against the takers, and President Obama repeating that everyone should pay their fair share in dozens of speeches since his State of the Union address. The president's liberal friends in Hollywood targeting a younger demographic using animated movies to sell their agenda to children.
Just a reminder, this is the same Fox that said this earlier this year.
For 60 years, American children have read the Sneetches and books like it. And that's one of the reasons we have the country we have today.
Well, cancel culture is now going after one of America's favorite children's books.
I want to look at silencing Seuss, Universal Orlando, pulling some of Dr. Seuss's books from its gift shop.
Dr. Seuss went from being a beloved childhood author to worse than Hitler in just a matter of days.
And if you want to go even farther back, in 1994, the National Oak Flooring Association was so genuinely pissed off about the Lorax teaching kids to respect the environment that they wrote their own book about how deforestation is good, actually.
Her book got picked up by a boutique indie publisher called the National Oak Flooring Manufacturers Association.
With arguments such as, well, what do you want to do then? Make houses out of plastic? The Onceler wasn't chopping down trees to build houses. He was chopping down trees to build a cheap, stupid, gimmicky product that cost $3.98. The "fine, something that old people need" line was a joke. He destroyed an entire ecosystem to make the equivalent of a sham wow. Even the 2012 movie got that.
But wait, there's more! Thanks to its all-natural microfibers, the thread is super absorbent!
The book also straight up says that it's okay if some species become extinct, which is pretty much the exact position of the Onceler and the unused Lorax song. And is this hinting that global warming is a hoax? But what about trees that are really quite old, that are cooling our planet and shouldn't be sold? I realized the guard bark did not want to know how the earth keeps on changing, so I spoke sort of slow.
So Burkett drew on her experience as a mother and as an assistant plant manager for a wood flooring manufacturer.
So when I was scripting this video, Lorax was actually available on Amazon for something like $80. But I can't find it anymore. I would suggest just looking for the PDF on Google and printing it out yourself if you want to kill some trees. It makes a great gift for that family member who you don't like.
Happy birthday!
I don't know, Traux.
Look at it.
Shoot. I don't know this. Did I know this? Looks like a knockoff Hobbit book. Oh, is this the Lorax?
Yeah. Do you like it?
I do.
Are you gonna read it every day?
Sure.
And even before the National Oak Flooring Manufacturing Association made this atrocity, in 1989, a logging town in California tried to get the Lorax banned for similar reasons. Geisel himself even responded to this, saying that the Lorax is about people who raise hell in the environment and leave nothing behind. I'm not saying logging people are bad. I live in a wooden house and sit in a wooden chair. Or how about back in 2012, a teacher at a British Columbia elementary school was forced to take out a quote from Yertle the Turtle she had put up because it was too political. The quote in question was, "I know up on top you are seeing great sights, but down here on the bottom we too should have rights." Really? The Butter Battle book was also highly contested. It's on the challenged books list for condoning war. Wow, okay. Oh, hey, look, there's the Lorax again. The National Review really doesn't like the Butter Battle book. It looks like they like to wish Dr. Seuss happy birthday every year for whatever reason. It's funny, they always start off with, well, he wasn't a conservative. But if you squint at some of his works, there might be a conservative reading there. But they usually take a shot at the Butter Battle book, and have even critiqued it a few times. Here's one from 2003. It is also a perfect emblem of the moral equivalence that neutered so many liberals during the Cold War. It assumes that the half-century conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union was based on nothing more meaningful than a dispute over how people prefer to butter their bread. As if communism wasn't a friend to liberty, but an eating preference. At 2004, he may have had some guts himself in the 40s, but read the Butter Battle book from his twilight years where he presents the struggle between American freedom and communist tyranny as really no different than what side of bread one chooses to butter. I'm not sure why he considers releasing and refusing to make changes to a book that everyone knew was going to stir up a lot of controversy, and probably make a subset of people very, very angry as not having guts. But hey, he seems to have a modicum of respect for Seuss in the 40s. Oh wow, a bunch of racist cartoons. That was really brave and unheard of in the 1940s. Oh wait, what's this? Another type of political cartoon drawn by Geisel, which straight up says that America first, an ideology based around American nationalism and isolationism, is the same thing as Nazism? Here's another with the exact same message, which shows that America first is not terribly bothered by what Hitler does to children, as long as those children are foreign. America First, by the way, is an ideology upheld by Woodrow Wilson, Warren G. Harding, and Donald Trump. If Ted Geisel had drawn this exact image today, he would have been heavily criticized by the right. But because he lived a long time ago and is considered a beloved childhood icon, they put him on a pedestal and turned him into a goddamn martyr when 6 of his books that no one even cares about gets discontinued. I mean, if we go onto the same site who just a few years ago were slamming Dr. Seuss for being a stupid liberal, we see them saying stuff like,
"We'll see incel culture has many faces. Few reveal the ugliness of the impulse more clearly than banning books. This time, the target of the book banners is perhaps the most beloved American author of all, Theodore Seuss Geisel, better known as Dr. Seuss. The culprits include Seuss's own heirs, the Biden administration, and the far-left Southern Poverty Law Center. Everyone involved should be ashamed of themselves."
This article by the way, goes on to bitch about the Butter book some more. The Butter Battle book, by contrast, written in Seuss's old age in 1984, preaches against arms races with a clumsy anti-Reagan subtext, but without much understanding that one of the parties to the Cold War was tyranny and one was not. Girl, holy shit, let it go. Another article on the site published around the same time says,
The memory of, perhaps, the single most beloved author in America was insulted by having that title and 5 others pulled as an anti-birthday present, and the traditional presidential mention of Dr. Seuss on a day built around his work was absent. It was as if all mentions of George Washington were scrubbed from the official celebration of President's Day. That'll never happen, though. Not until at least 2022.
Tucker Carlson actually pinpointed Dr. Seuss as a liberal.
Dr. Seuss was a preachy liberal.
And he did this whole spiel about the Sneetches, which isn't one of the discontinued books, by the way, but I think this was right before the official announcement, so this was more reacting to Joe Biden or the Virginia school thing. Again, neither one actually banned anything, but okay. What's with the shitty fan art? Did y'all not want to get sued? He does a really simple to-the-point analysis about how the message is that racism is bad.
Who cares who's got a star? What matters isn't the group you come from. What matters is you.
It's fine, you know, whatever. But then he ends the segment with,
The story is a plea for colorblindness. And that's why the forces of wokeness hate it, and Dr. Seuss. When the people in charge cancel Dr. Seuss, what they're really trying to eliminate is a very specific kind of mid-century American culture. A culture that championed meritocracy and colorblindness and the superiority of individual achievement over tribal identity. If your kids are allowed to read Dr. Seuss, they will know this was a different country not so long ago. A place where people tried hard not to hate each other. A place where the population was encouraged, begged by its leaders to reject identity politics in favor of universal values and the things that connect us all. Canceling Dr. Seuss isn't stupid, it's intentional. They're banning Dr. Seuss not because he was a racist, but precisely because he wasn't.
And, you know, there's a part of the Sneetches that I feel like often goes unexamined. Sylvester McMonkey McBean might not have caused the divide between the Sneetches, but he sure does take advantage of it. He targets the plain-bellied Sneetches first, but then when he goes after the starred-bellied Sneetches, who are scared and angered by the plain-bellied Sneetches trying to gain equal footing, he offers a way to make them feel like they're still on top, a way to bring back their sense of normalcy, the way things have always been, with them on the top and the plain bellies on the bottom, and then charges them more than triple what he made the plain-bellied Sneetches pay. He is profiting by escalating this tension between the two groups, literally taking all their money by keeping them outraged and making false promises of keeping one of the groups elevated and the other scrambling to keep up. And at the end of the day, just runs off with all their money, cackling about how stupid they all are.
They never will learn. No, you can't teach a Sneetch.
I just think that's interesting. That's all.
Butter, butter, butter bright. Every morning, noon and night. Spread your bread and spread it right.